parents were Richard Peters and Mary Jane Thompson Peters. Does anybody know, does anybody have heard either of those names? Yep, it's the Peters Mansion downtown. Yep. Peters Park at Georgia Tech. Yep. They founded All Saints. They're on the front. They're literally, if you're walking into All Saints, right there by the right of the door, there's a big plaque saying in honor of our founders, Richard and Mary Peters, right? So they're around town a lot. We'll understand why in just a minute. So they started, not sort of, they started in Atlanta. We'll see in a minute. So Richard, going to go back a little bit to have this history. Richard, at the age of 26, was put in charge of building the railroad through Georgia. He built it from Augusta to what was then Marthasville. That was the name of our town first. Marthasville. It really wasn't anything. Literally. There was, from what I've read and seen, there was like one shop and a crossroads and that's it. Nothing else here. But it was sort of a terminus before you got into the mountains, right? We're in the foothill of the Appalachians, so to get things started. So they were trying to go from Augusta to get up to the foothills. Then there was another railroad that was going to build coming down out of the Appalachian Mountains, right? So,
No.
26, he was put in charge of all that. Yeah.
Did you say approximately when that was? That was her father.
It was her father,
It was
1835,
building-
something like 1840, somewhere in that range. And so folks kept coming, kept complaining because when they had to write on the manifest, Augusta to Marthasville, Marthasville is a pretty long word. It's not really Mville or Martha's, or, I mean, it's sort of a weird phrase. People didn't love it. So he and one of his good friends, Lamell Grant, said, you know what, why don't we just do the feminine of Atlantic? Because the railroad they were connecting to was the Florida Atlantic Railroad, right? So using the feminine of Atlantic is Atlanta in Latin, and so Atlanta was born. And being the chief engineer, he designated the city Atlanta, where all the shipping crates would go, and so he effectively changed the name. Right? So, Richard bought 400 acres from North Avenue to 8th Street. In other words, all of Midtown he bought. Because he knew that this was going to be a terminus, this was going to be an area, and some terminus was another name that was used for a while because they just didn't have another name. But they knew 3 or 4 railroads were going to hit here. He knew it was going to be a town with a whole lot of growth and potential for growth, so he bought 400 acres knowing that it would grow and thrive, especially since he was also then in charge of putting all of the railroads' different businesses in the area, right? So he built and created pretty much the first of everything. The first steam factory, the first flour mill, the first stagecoach, the first railroad, the first post office, you name it, he built it on his land. Very convenient. It's a good profiting scheme, but that's what he did. Then he started building the first, worked with others to build the first homes in the area for the people that would come in and work in all those places, right? And Atlanta grew pretty quickly. And yes, you can say that slave labor was used for all or parts of all of these endeavors, right? It was 1830, 1840, where you cheaply build a railroad. You conscript slaves or you get prisoners. And so his wealth was born out of a certain degree of industry and cleverness, and also out of using the resources at the time, the cheapest labor you could, like any good capitalist, which was slave labor. During the war, he dove right in. He sold his steam engine for the Confederacy to build their ammunition. There was a steam engine that drove the flour mill and that kind of stuff. He sold it to the Confederacy for $14,000. Think about how much money that would be when 10 cents would buy you a meal. $14,000 was a lot of money to build ammunition. Then he also organized the railroad, so he was effectively the guy who made sure all of the trains ran on time to supply the troops at the front, as well as to bring food across the South, right? So we can say unequivocally that Richard Peters was the heartbeat, the backbone of the Confederacy. It's why General Sherman wanted to come to burn Atlanta. because of Richard Peters, quite frankly. He was the guy who built the railroad, who kept it running on time, and then also was building ammunition just up the road. It's why that became a target, right? Again, this is not, I'm not making any evaluations, this is just the story, right? This is who Richard Peters was. He worked with blockade runners to trade cotton for food and help keep the city fed. There's lots of things we can say about Margaret Mitchell's book, right? Gone with the Wind, but she got that part right. The South there was a blockade preventing them from selling, naval blockade, preventing food, cotton to be sold out of the ports of Charleston, Savannah, and those kinds of places where that was the trade before the war, how the South made most of its money. And they blockaded knowing that, so if they couldn't sell the cotton, then they couldn't bring in goods from other places or bring in food and keep people fed, right? There's a whole variety of things like that. Certainly there are farms in the area, but as the war tightened around Atlanta, people didn't have food. There was an option for food. Most of the resources went to the troops, and they became harder and harder, right? Questions on any of that? This is just our basic history. This is the basic Atlanta history combined with Miss Nellie's dad, who's part of our story, to say the least. All right. So, I'll be honest. I look forward to the day when we get to meet folks like Richard Peters, because this guy was a pretty fascinating character. He built the railroad. He basically ran the war effort in Atlanta for the South. But then somehow after the war ended, he contracted with the federal government to rebuild the railroad and put it right back. That's stuff right there. To not be arrested or put in jail or have anything else. I mean, somehow he was the guy that was hired to rebuild Atlanta. So he built it once, then he built it again, basically. He was in charge of rebuilding the railroad after the war. He rebuilt the city, named the streets. Each street was an existent street, so then he said, oh, well, we're going to go with trees, and there'll be Peachtree, and we'll do oak, and we'll do, write all those streets downtown that are just trees. That was his process. And then he just named them up to 8th Street, but then that's where his land ended, so he quit naming it 8th Street. His land ended at 8th, so he said, I'm done. That's where my property ends. And yes, the Peters Mansion that's still downtown, that is the family homestead. That's where Miss Nellie grew up. I think, or they might have rebuilt it on that property. I don't know the history of that house long. But he even donated 4 acres to found a technical school in the area that you are mentioning, right? Peters Park. He said, as a good engineer, we need an engineering school to help build all this kind of stuff. So help found Georgia Tech. So you have lots of interesting history just for her dad, right? And they were devout Episcopalians. They went to St. Philip, which is where we initially started as a mission. We were a mission of St. Philip. And that is basically when we say mission, that means St. Philip Church was writing the checks to make sure all the lights stayed on and everything kept going. Clearly there was some degree of a falling out, or maybe they just wanted one closer to the house, because a few years later, about 10, 15 years later, they started, the Peters left St. Philip and started All Saints. But they also contributed to the construction of St. Luke's. So pretty much all 3 of the big churches downtown benefited from the Peters largesse and helped build what is effectively the Episcopal Diocese of Atlanta, quite frankly. When you start talking about the oldest churches that are in Atlanta, the Peters were a small one. And they were good friends with that. So, his eldest daughter was Mary Ellen Peters. Everybody called her Nellie. And let's be honest, her family was royalty of Atlanta. They owned the city. They built the city. They named the city. They ran the trains that went through and carried anything in and out of the city. You name anything, they were the family, right? And as the firstborn eldest daughter, she was that royalty, right? And people looked to her and to her family for all sorts of information and stuff. Which meant that she, of course, had to be educated, so they sent her to Pennsylvania to be educated. But that happened when she was older. She grew up in the city, and some of her letters and info has some stuff just recognizing the horrors of war. She was young, obviously, about 10, 11 when the war started. But by the time the war concluded, she was 13, 14, and there's a book, even I have not read, but there's a little book that someone wrote on her behalf where her handkerchief, I don't understand it, this is one of those really cheesy, a little bit maudlin things from the Civil War, but Miss Nellie's handkerchief got left in St. Philip's Church, and they burnt Sherman came through, burned the church, but somehow her handkerchief survived, so someone wrote a book, and you can find it on Amazon. It literally is about Miss Nellie's handkerchief and what it saw. As the city burned around it, I guess. It's sort of like, okay, fair enough. And it's written by, it was a priest at the church at the time who became bishop of the Diocese of Tennessee later. So, anyway, so she was not sheltered from the horrors of the war. She remembered literally fleeing with her parents on the last train out of the city because her dad being in charge of the trains and of basically half the city. They stayed until pretty much the last night before Sherman came through. So she saw wounded soldiers. She saw all sorts of horrors. Her home was burnt, everything, right? I mean, she recognized the horrors of it. She's not as clear or as filled with commentary about slavery or anything that we've seen from the Peters or from Miss Nellie. Either in for or against, which since they didn't say anything, I would assume that they were benefiting from it. They were at least partially for it. It's hard to say. Definitively where they are because they didn't say this. So after the war, they sent her to Pennsylvania to one of the finest boarding schools for women there, and what was then called finishing school, right? She got all of her proper manners, was taught appropriately, came back at the age of 18 to Atlanta, and she started realizing that there was a great deal of need in the city, because basically what happened after the war, as they started to rebuild the city, it was very quickly, and this is, again, to Richard Peters' credit, Sherman literally burnt the city and pulled up all the railroads, right? Literally, that was his job. Peters knew the process so well that they tore up the railroads, and within 3 months he had built them back in total. That's pretty fast work by any estimation. So he had rebuilt the railroads, and then basically people who had lost families during the war, soldiers who had been injured, all had to come basically to the nearest city, which was Atlanta. And then you had the freedmen as well, and women came to the city. So you had this influx of people coming to the city, but not a whole lot of jobs for people in the city. So poverty was an enormous problem, and poverty that we don't, quite frankly, really recognize in American TV, right? I mean, say what you want about a variety of our systems, but there are housing options and food stamps and all sorts of government options for caring for folks in poverty at this point. At that point, if you didn't have anything, you literally didn't have anything. And there wasn't an option for getting anything. Maybe the local church could help with a meal or two, but that's about it. So it was all on social services, personal choice to care for those in need that helped or didn't. All right. So the city became flooded, and as she came back, she found a great deal. Same thing again. Here they are. So this is the earliest photo we have. Miss Nellie here on the left, and here she is on the right. Her when she's a young woman before the war. So on her 21st birthday, so just to back up just a second, when she came back, she recognized immediately there were needs in the city. She almost immediately began to do mission work and care for people in the area, doing all sorts of classes, food programs, you name it, she was involved in it. She was a very socially active woman, and when I say social, not like dating, she was active in social services and caring for those in need, right? Recognized that the war had wrought horrible things, and she wanted to do what she could to help people who were in need. So with that in mind, she was doing that for years, and around, I think it was her 18th or 19th birthday, she said we need a new Episcopal mission, the Sunday school mission that would eventually become Holy Innocents. She said there was a need for a Sunday school mission. At that point, a Sunday school mission really meant, yes, a church, but also a place where people could be educated, not just about the Bible, but in everything, right? There weren't a lot of public schools that were viable in those days. So a mission, a Sunday school mission is how it was described, would be literally teaching people to read as they might be talking about Jesus and God and the Spirit, right? So it's sort of both and. She was more or less saying we start a preschool / religious school almost. So, on her 21st birthday, this is the famous story, Nellie's father, Richard Peters, gave her $100 and bought a dime. Again, that's an enormous amount of money. It's hard when you sort of put those in inflation calculators. I put that in there and it said it would be about $12,000 today, give or take. I'll go with that. Maybe worth more, maybe worth less. But she walked down Peachtree, her house was right there on Peachtree, not too far away, down to the Merchants to buy one. She returned an hour later, he claimed, Father, I have it done. Right? He said, well, I'm going to see it. She said, well, come outside and I'll show you. Father brought outside, and she was standing with a black saddle horse with a distinct blotch and white hair on the diamond on his forehead. And then she said, here's my diamond, and with them I will be able to increase the amount of assistance I can give to needy families that now. All right? So, we don't know for sure, but we went to, all of Miss Nellie's papers are at the manuscripts for the University of Georgia, the Rare Manuscripts Library in Georgia, so we went and looked. And we did find this one photo that's with hers, but it sure looks like there's a white diamond pattern on that horse. I don't know if that's actually the horse or not, but it's the one photo we found that was sort of like it. Could be, could not, who knows. But what we can say unequivocally, she was known in the Ford community for coming daily to care for people there. She and her diamond were known for driving through the poor parts of town and regularly caring for people and doing what she could to help folks. Pretty exceptional, really. I don't know about y'all, when I was 18 or 21, I was not doing that. I'd love to say I was. I was doing some work. I wasn't daily going to the poor, tutoring, feeding, caring, and finding out what else could be done. And she was protected, from what we can read between the lines as well, that while she was absolutely a person of enormous privilege, people protected her still because they knew that she was helping. And they didn't want anything to happen to her in those areas that a lot of people would be robbed, mugged, you name it, right? So, in 1872, she founded Holy Innocents Mission with a piece of her father's land on Ponce de Leon. If you look in the official records, and this is totally how the church works, right? She wore her dad out to give land, and she wore her dad out to give money. So if you look on the official records for the Episcopal Diocese, it'll say that Richard Peters gave the land to the church. Right? That he was officially the founder of our parish. But everyone called it Miss Nellie's church, because she was the one who was there every single Sunday teaching, arranging the clergy, doing all that kind of stuff, because she organized everything. The records that we have, she would do the same thing every Sunday. She would go to church in the morning at St. Philip. They would have lunch at their house afterwards. And then, there's a great line of something like, she would leave, regardless of who was dining with her, to go and be at Holy Innocents by one. So she was leave people at the table if the lunch was going too long to go and work all afternoon. So she would then go and have a service and start tutoring and doing a variety of things at the Holy Innocents Mission. Right. So, she worked with all these families because she believed that they were innocents caught in poverty. So we've talked about the Holy Innocents of our day, right? In recent years here. We were named Holy Innocents because she saw all these folks as innocents of the war. Maybe they fought, maybe they didn't, but they were just all caught in poverty and they were innocent of anything where they just deserved to be poor. Right? That was her belief. That's what she called Holy Innocents. Like I said, she was well known in the Tight Squeeze neighborhood. That is at 10th and Peachtree. There was a large gully that they say went down about 100 feet, give or take. And so the road had to curve around the gully, and it was a very tight road in that spot. And so it became known as the Tight Squeeze neighborhood. Right? Does anybody know what's at the corner of 10th and Peachtree now? Just sort of, it was literally after the Civil War. It was the poorest neighborhood in Atlanta, and it's literally where she built her church, like not too far from there. But does anybody know where it is now?
The Fed's doing that.
The Fed. It's the Federal Reserve. The exact opposite. It's literally that corner, it's 10 of the future, is the Federal Reserve. And the Margaret Mitchell home's on the other corner. Yeah, yeah. So you have a sort of fascinating turn for that neighborhood that really for the 20, 30 years after the Civil War was the poorest, most economically depressed area. There's lots of articles you can go back, you can Google it, Tight Squeeze neighborhood in Atlanta, and you will see countless articles about the robbings and the muggings and the horrible things that were happening there. Because it was just a combination of basically wounded, shell-shocked veterans, freedmen, and the victims of the war, widows, orphans, a whole variety of folks who were just trying to get by. Right? I don't know about y'all, but this would be the equivalent of being the roughest neighborhood in Atlanta now. Literally getting on a horse and riding to the roughest neighborhood in Atlanta. That's what she did every single Sunday. So, she certainly had privilege. She benefited from a great deal of different things, but she was not afraid to put herself on line and go into the roughest corners. This is a map of the area at the time. It's Peachtree Road, right here, 10th Street. Yes, 10th Street, right? So the church was down here a little bit, and pots are over, but then when the first church was blown down in a tornado, when they rebuilt literally right over here. Right by the Tight Squeeze neighborhood, because that's where she did the most of was. So again, our history is pretty fascinating with her and her family, and on one hand you have stories about how they profited in a great deal from the war and a whole variety of different tactics that aren't so great, and on some other hand, it's some amazing work. Then, seeing desperate need, she became an advocate for the poor on lots of levels. She started King's Hospital, and then King's Hospital didn't do well, so they started Grady to provide health care for the poor. Right, so it was the first municipal hospital. She worked for 30 years to start kindergarten. This was a new idea from Germany. All these German immigrants came over talking about how they educated their kids a year or two younger than they would in America, and so started advocating for kindergarten. It took her 30 years to convince the city of Atlanta to make it universal, but she eventually did. And she worked for 25 years to get women to the University of Georgia because she needs someone to teach those kindergarten classes. Right? So you can see clearly almost all of her social work came from the mission work she did in Tight Squeeze, in the neighborhoods, and really with Polius. It's pretty extraordinary. It's a pretty extraordinary life. She also, let's see, can I put this in here? There this is her as a young woman with her friends, clearly. She had to stop riding the Tight Squeeze when she got married at 26. She was probably an old baby. That is married, right? She was a woman, full house, get married. And it was a little bit of a scandalous marriage. She got married to a man who was 48, and he was a representative in the House for the state House for Georgia, and then was eventually elected to the House of Representatives as a representative from Georgia, right? So she married him and had to back off some of that kind of stuff. They had 2 daughters together, but he died about 3 years after their marriage, so did not make it too long. She never married again. And he had a large farm, and she ended up running the farm because clearly Miss Nellie could do anything. To prove she could do anything, she then taught the farmers about crop rotation and how to improve outputs and yields by changing up your crops. Again, I'm a big fan of Miss Nellie. She isn't perfect, but she's a heck of a woman on every level. And she would go around the South lecturing on the importance of crop rotation, because cotton's really, really hard in the soil. Tobacco is really, really hard in the soil, but it's really lucrative for either of those. But if you shift every year or two between some things and replenish the soil, you'll keep things going a lot better than just depleting it. So she opened her farm and became more and more active in social policies across the South for a wide variety of things. Now what we can say is, she was running a farm, a very large plantation, that probably was slave-based before the war, and after the war was sharecropper, right? It was all sharecropper, which was Jim Crow South. How poorly can we pay and treat people of color to work the farm to make sure that you get as much money as possible, right? So while she's enlightened and doing the best she can in some areas, in some other ways, she missed the train, right? Didn't quite get everything perfect, but then that's all of us have our people at the same time, right? There's nobody who's perfect. Nobody did it all figured out. So, but that said, she was progressive liberal, who pushed for limits to the poor and those in need. We literally found an article about, and this was 1910, where they were interviewing her about what needed to happen in the South, for the New South, and she said, we need to educate all of the children of the South, black and white alike, and she encouraged women to start schools, especially in rural communities, to educate everyone, because literacy and education is going to be the key to getting people out of poverty or getting people in a better place. So again, incredibly progressive in some areas, and then some other areas not progressive. It's a fascinating thing, and I think some of it she clearly, as I read some of her letters and different info, it seems like she sort of has, like all of us, an arc where as we get older, we learn more, right? We figure things out a little bit better sometimes. And some of the things we never quite get past, and that's part of it too. At the same time, we can say it was also nice to retire at a really large sum with lots of money. Sometimes we can be flippant and say it's really easy to be progressive when you've got all the daddy's money floating behind you too, and your widowed husbands, your deceased husbands, money and farm working as well, right? She did amazing work. That does not discount her work, but some of these things help as well, right? It's the complexity of the story. So we found a specific reference. This is one of the hard ones from a letter in 1918 to Mary Turner. You might know the story of Mary Turner. This is a horrible story. People don't know. You know Mary Turner? Yeah. This is what it is to be white in the South, my friends. Mary Turner is an incredibly notorious story that we don't get taught in schools because it's a horrible story. Her husband, she was a young pregnant black woman. Her husband was lynched in Valdosta. What happened is there was a prominent white landowner who was killed, got a dispute with one of his tenant farmers. The farmer killed him, and he was black, killed the white farmer. They lynched him, but then as mobs tend to do in those situations, they got mad at anyone who had been a tenant farmer for this white farm owner, also got lynched. That included her husband. He was innocent of any issue of doing anything to this man, but he got caught because he was black, and also part of that, and they thought it was a conspiracy, so we had to kill all the co-conspirators. Mary, God bless her, decided this was unjust, as we all know it is, and protested, and was very vocal that she was going to sue the city, or she was demanding justice for her husband, who did not deserve to be lynched, had done nothing wrong, and deserved better treatment. She was tortured and burned alive, hung, and the child cut from her womb. I mean, horrible stuff. Horrible stuff. Made national news, reported in the New York Times, everywhere. This was a major event in the South in 1918. As it should be, right? And this is a story we don't know as white folk, because these are not comfortable stories to hear. But it was that story. So, Nellie was 67, prominent white activist and numerous agencies and in the Women's Club. And because she was president of the Women's Club, she got a letter from the Negroes Women's Club saying that she needed to renounce this horrible moment. But her response instead was reported as, until you teach your people not to molest the whites, there can be no adjustment. So while we have this image of her in so many ways of being progressive, her response clearly is not what any of us want to be for a moment that, I don't know how you really say anything other than, no, that was horrible. But that was her response. So when we talk about difficult history, this is the kind of difficult history we have, right? It's not As we know, it's not a straight line. And it's not, we're all imperfect people doing the best we can, and sometimes we get it right, and sometimes. Well, I love Miss Nellie, she got it wrong. Right? So when I arrived here, what I can also say is very few people I would ask. There's a picture in our hallway of all the church buildings, and there's a random picture of an older woman and her 2 daughters. And I would ask people, who is that? And everyone just goes, I don't know. It's Miss Nellie. So most people didn't know who she was, and pretty much no one had a clue who Deaconess Wood is. Catherine Wood. Anybody heard of Catherine Wood? Our altar is literally dedicated to her memory and honor. She ran the church for 40 years. After Miss Nellie died, and we were at that point a mission of All Saints because her parents had moved to All Saints, so the money was coming through All Saints instead of through St. Philip. All Saints hired Deaconess Wood, who ran the church from, I think it was 1915, or it was 1912 to 1945, or 1948, somewhere in that range. For a good 30, 40 years, she ran the church. She was the person who was there every Sunday, was paid to lead. We contracted with priests to come and do the communion once a month, all that kind of work, right? So you have 2 women who ran the church for 73 years between the 2 of them. Neither get mentioned in our story. And don't get me wrong, I love Bob and I love Joe. Their pictures are up on the wall, they're beautiful. But I'm pretty sure if they were men, if Miss Nellie and Deaconess Wood were men, they would have oil paintings right up there too, wouldn't they? I would guess. They'd be too important to ignore. So, again, they ran the church from 1872 to 1945. And for pretty much the first half of our history, we're run by 2 women, which, if you want to talk about extraordinary, that's extraordinary. That's a story we couldn't tell enough, quite frankly, because that's just grace in the church. Especially for those years. So we have to name that probably got a little misogyny in our system, like we do in all of our systems. But when you literally can say, hey, look, we have the paintings of 2 great white guys who helped us. We have photos of 3 white guys, 2 of which got fired for not being so perfect, right? One left with the church secretary, one for embezzlement. We've got all those photos up. We don't have anything of these 2 women who've done extraordinary work, right? Our history then is complex. Again, we can objectively say she did some great work. Miss Nellie did some amazing work. And then we can also objectively say, at least through our lens in the 21st century, she did not rise to the occasion in her life. I don't know that that precludes her from oil painting. But that's part of how do we want to tell our story, right? This is how and part of what we're doing right now as we do this history work is trying to say, well, here's the whole history. Now what do we want to do with it? Do we want to have oil paintings of these 2 women too? Or just tell their story and have photos? Or how do we want to honor and recognize their enormous contributions to how we got here, right? And we can't say that they're no racist. Our history didn't report any of it. It was when we did the history work to find out about them that we found out some of this other info, right? About Miss Nellie. And then Catherine Wood has a little margin. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks when we get to her. But we can also say that we have those directors that have done great things and some awesome great stuff. So in other words, hey, our history is complex. And, but we can't write, we're literally writing the first 150 years of our history. And so now the question comes to us, how do we want to write that history? I've instructed our historian to tell the whole story, right? To talk about everything that we just presented. Not with any judgment, but this is just the history. I mean, we can like it or we can not like it. That's up to us. We can love the story or hate the story, but this is the story, right? That we are a parish born from the generosity of a family that made money in ways that are not always perfect. We can talk about how we are born really from the passion of one woman for caring for the poor, which is fantastic. and the progressive ideas that she championed and the ways that she worked in the world, which is great. And then we also have to say that she wasn't perfect and there were things she didn't get right too. And I'm probably sure if one day when we get to see the full ledger, we'll see there were lots more good and bad things that she did in her life, right? But it's just to say that there's not that perfect through line. And I don't want our history to be one. I'm sure y'all all read history books, right? For the first 200 years of the University of Georgia, the first whatever years of, Emory or what, you name it. It's amazing how often those get whitewashed, and I use that term intentionally here. Whitewashed of all that stuff that's complex and hard. As people of faith, I would argue, our job is to tell the whole story and recognize that God's with us in the midst of it, even if it's not the ones we want to hear. Right? It's not the story we want to hear. What else do I have here? So, yeah. But I want to talk about our past and our present as honestly as possible so we can strive to talk about God's kingdom for the next 150 years. That is, now knowing more about Miss Nellie and how she started the church. Who should we be as a community now, right? I think you can point to some of her amazing charitable work and go, oh, would she be proud of the level of our outreach now, or would she want more, right? Would she look at our congregation and be excited about the things we're doing, or sort of like, it's okay, but other things need to happen, right? I mean, through what ideals, what are we called to be as a church in the 21st century and beyond? All right, so, again, Catherine Meeks is going to weigh in and answer all these questions as our expert. We couldn't get Zoom to work. So, questions, lots of comments. This is a lot, I know. My job is really just to give an overview of the history and then to go into the questions next. Anything from the history you want to talk about, for example? How does it make you feel? I'll ask the first question. How does it make you feel to know Miss Nellie's story?
Phil, I missed the setup, so I didn't hear that Catherine Meeks was going to be part of the conversation now. What was she going to contribute, and how are we engaging with her?
So this class is going to be 3 weeks. This week we were talking about Miss Nellie. Next week we're going to talk about our move from 10th Street and 10th and Springs, the corner that we were on, which by the way is now 85. That's why we moved out here. That's the way next week, but at least part of it was the interstate came through. And then the following week is Deaconess Wood, and basically trying to get us up to our move here in 54. And so Catherine is going to be part of our conversation because these are complex stories that are not simply about the church, but also they're deeply connected to race, because let's be honest, everything in the South, for race said, well, for almost all race has been connected to race, and where we have excelled in caring for each other as God's children, and we have not met that mark, right? And so part of that is to how do we have these hard conversations and hold that tension the way we should, look into the future, and how do we also just work with that whole process, right? And Catherine has a lot more history, and she's got a PhD in doing that kind of work. I don't. And so we were hoping to bring her in to have that conversation. And a lot of her conversation was going to be around how do we just ask some of these questions, right? How do we talk about, well, knowing the history, what is our future look like? Knowing the history, how do we tell our story? And those kinds of words. So yeah, go for it.
So one thing that she wants to address is how the connection between knowing our history and racial healing and reconciliation, how those two things sort of can fit together to sort of put us all in that place for reconciliation, which I think that, we all want. But it's sort of important because like sometimes it can go like, well, why is knowing all these things about our history so important, especially if they're bad and things that we really don't want to hear and not pleasant things. So that's another conversation that we want to have over the next few weeks.
Right. We'll get all the Zoom stuff figured out. Zoom is not cooperating this morning. She was going to Zoom in with us. And she'll zoom in next week and the following week with those kinds of processes. Yeah. So how do we feel? I mean, we feel good, we feel bad, we feel troubled, hopeful. What would be some of the feelings we have? That's a great question.
Among lots of other things, it's just really fascinating. It's really fascinating. I haven't done Ancestry.com for myself yet, but I want to. But it sort of feels like,
Yeah,
oh, wow, look at that.
yeah.
Well, and pretty amazing a woman during that time, at that age, did everything she did. I understand kind of what all was going on there with the slavery and everything else, but pretty amazing that she even still saw a need and went out there and didn't just get other people to fill the need, she actually herself filled the need.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's an extraordinary story when you talk about an era when women were allowed to own land or have property or write checks or you name it, right? All these kinds of things she couldn't do or somehow still. Or vote, or yeah. I mean, she died before their vote was approved, right? All of it. But somehow was neck deep in all of it.
Do we know anything about her husband, his name, or his background?
I mean, yeah, we have some info about her husband. I skipped over. Part of it today was really, I sort of shorted her story just a little bit so that we could get into the conversation. Just put the highlights and the difficult parts of the story together so that we could look. He was, again, he was older, 46, 47 when they got married. Her senior by about 20 years. He had property. I'm not sure if he fought. No, he was too young. I don't know if he fought in the war or not. I'd have to go back and look at his history. But there's more history on him. But again, he died young enough and was mainly a political life, so I don't know if we have much info about him.
Was he from Atlanta?
No, he was from, I'll get it wrong. I want to say it was down by Columbus, but I could be wrong. Somewhere south.
Was the farm down there, did she kind of relocate them?
Yeah, so she relocated to the farm for a season. She was trying to get that up and running, and she would go back and forth between her parents and her house here in Atlanta, and then down.
What was her husband's name?
It was Black. It was his last name. I can look it up quickly. I mean, so to give you an idea of how this is one of those things you just have to laugh about the world. I was here, a lot of times I'm here in the evening, but then there's that sort of dead time in the afternoon where, I'll be honest, I'm not really at my highest functioning level from say 4:30 to 6 between the next meeting, right? So there's that time when you sort of wander the building or you walk around and sort of just get up to move. So I went by that picture and wanted to know who this woman was. There is a name, so I Googled Nellie Peters, it was Nellie Peters Black. And she comes up for Wikipedia and was it Significant Women of Georgia or something like that. There's 3 or 4 Google entries that put me down the rabbit hole of learning more about her. And if you Google her and then Wikipedia comes up, then you can click to her husband that also has a little bit of a history there. It's Wikipedia, so it's not always the highest level of research, but at least it starts you on that kind of finding things about her family. And that's literally how we started going down the rabbit hole. Someone wrote her doctoral thesis on Mary Ellen Black, which is where a lot of our info comes from. This woman literally got her PhD learning about her. Which, I don't, this is not the exact answer, but it's pretty hilarious. The title is Nellie Peters Black, God's Own Democrat. was the title of her thesis, where it was basically talking about the progressive bent at the time. The funny thing is, it says God's Own Democrat, but I believe at that time, political parties shift their polarities. I don't know if you'll realize this, but it happens often.
Yes.
At that point, I think she was actually a Republican, but a progressive Republican.
It's not anymore.
In that era. So it's so weird how those things go backwards. They go back and forth. But anyway, it is what it is. So yeah, I don't know a whole lot more about her husband. They won't answer. It'd be good things to yes, ma'am.
I just think, the picture gallery is a very interesting concept about how we maintain structures and systems the way they are, like, maintaining slavery. But in this case, maintaining for all the generations that grow up here, the girls, the women never see anything in the gallery that's familiar.
Right.
Or, oh, I can, or that's not a mirror image, but it's something I identify with. That's just really interesting. And I've lived in that in the church, wearing a man's shirt and collar, and the galleries are always all men. And it's just interesting. And by posting those, we maintain that concept and way of thinking for, girls and women.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, full disclosure, that was my original conversation with, that Kenny and I were having, was a way to tee off this conversation with you. Should we have oil paintings of these two women, right? Should they be right out there with the rest? I would argue yes. But it's how do we have an honest conversation about what we're communicating with oil paintings in our hallway or our photos, either way. And I've long maintained I still want to be an oil painting. I don't want to be the photo that says but it's that larger question of, should we, for women who literally, one started the church and ran it for a good 30 years, the other ran it for 30, 40 years, I would argue they should be on the hallway.
Yes.
Right? I mean, they should be right up there, telling that story as well, which then says something about us. Right? Even if we also know that they weren't perfect and they had their feelings and foibles. And let's be honest, if Joe were here, he'd laugh and say, oh yeah, me too. Like, you can put my old paint up on the wall, but I ain't perfect. And I'm sure history will be kind in some areas and not kind in other areas. We'll be wrong. Yeah.
Was the broader Episcopal Church acknowledging of them and their role?
Yeah, so Deaconess Wood, we'll talk about this in a couple of weeks. She was very much acknowledged for her work and well respected and loved. She wore a nun's habit, as deaconesses did in that era, and sort of had a vow to serve those in need and the poor. And so women weren't ordained until 1979 in the church, or 1973. I think was the first, was the Philadelphia 8, that were regularly ordained. That is, they were ordained before the rules had changed, but that's when it started. 30 years after she died. But she was part of a very small group of women that were given permission to be ordained as deaconess, a sort of in-between ranking, where she had that authority as a minister of the church, but wasn't really a priest, right? So, an in-between, but she was very much revered, and there are lots of things talking about the work she did.
So
Miss Nellie was more revered for all of her sort of progressive, like forgetting kindergarten, forgetting women in Georgia, for like all the sort of other work she did around the city and starting, hospitals for the poor.
So as a deaconess, was she one of the first women to have a role as a deacon?
She was the only deaconess in the Diocese of Georgia in that era. Yeah, and then later in the Diocese of Atlanta. There was I think she was the first, and then there was an African American woman in like Savannah. Anyway, there's only like 2, maybe 3 women that had that role. Most, as we would expect, right? She had to go to New York for her training, and most of the people who were deaconesses that worked sort of in that northeastern corridor stayed around that area, and the bishops allowed to work in the area.
So when did women begin to fill that role? Do you have any idea?
The priestly role or the
No,
deaconess role?
the deaconess role.
Oh, it was all, there's like, we could look up the dates for that school. We'll talk about that in 2 weeks. We get to Catherine, but the deaconess school was only open from like 1880 to 1920 or something like that, and then they shut it down because the bishops didn't like these women coming to holy orders and reminding them of things they need to do. This woman got too mouthy in the councils of the church. We started, not surprisingly, advocating for being ordained fully, right? I mean, a lot of that stuff that they backed on for a while for deaconesses until later on.
Because Bill, one thing I'll say about the paintings, and I've been here not quite 50 years or close to it.
Yeah.
This is the first time Southern there, I can really dig into this history. I mean,
Yeah.
sure, in passing, you'd hear the name Billy Waters.
Right.
But you heard, it wasn't
Yeah.
let's get into that more, and maybe that was because people didn't want it. I don't know what all the reasons were, but I think that
Yeah.
now we're digging into it.
I think some of it's that. I mean, I think some of it, Joe Reynolds, and I think he's right, says we're really sort of two parishes. You have the parish that was downtown, you have the parishes in Sandy Springs, and there's very little crossover of membership, because it was, I mean, it'd be the equivalent of us saying, okay, we're gonna sell this property and move to Dahlonega. How many of you are going to church in Dahlonega? Right? No one. I'll just go around the corner to something else, right? So you have, in a way, while it's one, the name has stayed the same, and while it's certainly, we actually have some of the stuff from the first church, maybe the bell out front, and some of the offering plates, all those kinds of things have carried over. They are sort of two separate histories, and so it sort of gets caught in that too, I think. Where people go, well, really the history here is with Bob and with Joe and with Saucy and those kinds of guys that have all been here. But I've also found as a parish, this is a parish that doesn't talk a whole lot about history, even if it's the more recent history, right? I mean, even then they sort of go, well, that happened, what are we doing next week? They don't want to talk about history anyway. Whether it's, even if it's, you know, Bob was so great, he was great, he did the greatest young couples group or whatever, which we all hear about. Even then, it's sort of like, he did that, but are we going to have a young couples group is usually the next question, not let's dive into what Bob did or didn't do. Anything else?
So are any of the pictures that are hanging representative of the church that was downtown?
No, at this point we don't have any. None of the, certainly all the records, and whether they're paintings or photos, are all of Sandy Springs. And then we don't have, it's in the church offices that we have a couple of the photos of the second building. We don't have any photos of the original building, because that blew down in 1878 in Grenada. And there's not any images of that. But we have the next ones.
And so, I'm sorry I missed the first part, but,
That's okay.
so was the deaconess like the person in the old church? And then when it moved here is when they got a priest?
They got a priest, so she was in charge for like about 30, 40 years. And then towards the end of her tenure, they had enough money to become a parish, and they could afford a priest, so they hired a male priest, but she continued her work as deaconess and helping organize and run different.
And did that person move up here with the church?
Well, so we had one rector who was only rector for like 2 years. The first one was very brief. The second one helped facilitate the move out here. It was here for maybe a year, and then was called to be a rector elsewhere. And so then it's really Saucy that was the guy who physically built that building that is now the parish hall and got everything going for the new building, started the school, all that kind of stuff. And then left the church secretary. Oops. Again, our history is a checker. That's all histories are. All right, my friends, we got baptisms here in a few minutes, so we'll go peace.